So welcome and thank you for coming. Tonight's Dharma talk, we're going to talk about the 8 limbs of yoga, including the yamas and the niyamas. And we'll talk about the concepts of abhyasa and vairagyam, two of my favorite concepts to teach about. To get started, we're going to ring the bell and then sit quietly for the next while. So as the bell goes to silence, so too will we, also inviting the mind to do the same. When we come to silence and share the intention for the mind to settle, it doesn't necessarily imply that your mind will settle. Sometimes habit is stronger than the ability to settle in. If that's the case this evening, give yourself a little place to rest, to actively rest your attention. My recommendation right now would be either tune in to where you make contact with the physical ground beneath you, or tune in to the experience of sound as it is occurring in the natural environment around us. But choose one of those to rest your attention on, and to do so kindly and repeatedly. Thank you very much. I'm going to ask if somebody wouldn't mind closing the door to our room. So during this relatively brief period of silence, I wonder how many found the mind to be tranquil?
Towards the end.
Towards the end, and at times you said. How many found the mind to be more bumpy? Changeable, right? Yeah. And of those who found it might be kind of bumpy, and or anybody else, was it also habitual? Yeah, so some familiar patterns and chit-chat. Yeah, the 8 limbs of yoga are suggested as a pathway, kind of like stepping stones. And those stepping stones are to lead towards the exquisite experience of samadhi, which is the 8th limb of yoga. And we hear about them in the Yoga Sutras, but we don't hear about the 8 limbs as the first thing. First we hear that yoga happens when the mind ceases to fluctuate. That yoga happens when the mind is tranquil. And by that regard, they mean yoga, not asana. Yoga like love or consciousness or grace occurs. The felt sense of being at one with, that occurs when the fluctuations of the mind become tranquil. It actually says when they cease, or when they become restricted. Yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Nirodha can mean to restrict or to cease. I haven't found that my mind patterns cease. They do quiet and they become more tranquil. But mind stuff will still occur. Mind stuff means the vrittis. It'll still occur because we have day-to-day lives with some responsibilities and some elements that require thought. What I have found is that the mind is much less troubling. It's much less bothersome. And perhaps that's a taste of samadhi in itself. It's not quite so bothersome, and it's often not quite so believable either. And in fact, the less I have believed in certain parts of the mind patterns, the more infrequently they show up. So they visit less often. They're a little bit like the opposite of the feral cat that you're trying to woo or feed, where you say, "Here, kitty, kitty," and you actually want to tame the feral cat. In this case, I stopped feeding certain mind patterns, and they were less interested in coming around. I was not tempting them so often. I wasn't giving them treats or feeding them anymore. So in that regard, the 8 limbs are a helpful stepping stone for the direction in which we're hoping to move. And you can think of it a little bit like gaining elevation on a mountain, that if you were to go hiking at certain altitudes, you would want to be training for that. If you're going to hike at altitudes in which you might need supplemental oxygen and or training to be at that altitude, you would probably prepare. You would do some other altitude hiking or bring supplemental oxygen with you. So that training process is happening at the first couple limbs of the 8 limbs. Essentially training the mind and the heart and our lives to come more into the experience of yoga. I think it's quite elegant, really, the path that's laid before us. And one sort of tiny sorrow that I have about the way yoga comes to the West is that it's predominantly asana. So we hear about the yoga class, which is really the asana class, and we go to the asana class, and we feel much better about our lives, which I think is terrific. But then we may not be inclined to repair the parts of the life that weren't feeling so good before the yoga class. Have you ever had that experience? Mm-hmm. It's funny, you feel perhaps compelled and urgent and committed before the class to make a certain change. You have the experience of the yoga asana. Your nervous system is regulated back to ease and grace. The heart feels more open, the mind more clear, and the urgency fades for making the change you are about to commit to. And that's why the yamas and niyamas are the first 2 limbs of yoga, not asana as the first limb of yoga. In fact, asana wasn't meant just to repair your life temporarily. It's meant to help you transform your life. And what happens on the yoga mat in the form of asana is a bridge between the yamas and niyamas and what happens after asana in the limbs of yoga, that we would go from asana to pranayama. So if asana is the bridge, we have to know from which shore we're crossing to which other shore we're going. I will come back around to the yamas and niyamas in a few moments. But pardon me for smiling impishly at our Western culture that we really got hooked onto asana, and much less so the precepts that happen before asana. But that is the nature of the West, and we have conditioned minds, Western minds mostly in this room. So asana as a yoga practice, as a time to be on your yoga mat practicing awakening, asana is actually quite ideal for the Western mind because, as I said earlier today, Western mind is rajasic, and asana can help us to settle that down. And Western bodies are primarily tamasic if they sit at desks too long during the day, and asana can help to move that. So asana is really a great remedy for what's happening with our Western inclination to be tamasic bodies, rajasic minds. Tamasic body means lethargic, too often still, a little bit lazy. I'm not saying that you in this room are lazy, I'm just commenting on Western culture at large. And then rajasic minds means highly vacillating mind, active mind, grasping mind, averting mind, kind of greedy mind going out in these different destinations, looking for a fix, essentially. So asana, when you're actually practicing, you get to glimpse yourself in action, if you're paying attention. Or you could practice the asana to just get the poses figured out and get some goals accomplished there for your head to reach your toes. This was told to me when I was first practicing yoga, that if I sat with my legs out straight in front of me and I could get my head to my toes, my teacher would award anybody in the class who could do that, he would award them with a trip to France. I tried to make my toes longer to reach my head. And I bend forward like a jackknife. I mean, I just like a panini grill, like that, all the way down. But my head was not going to touch my toes. The geometrics don't work out. But we were goal-oriented back in the day. We were going to make the head touch the toes. We were going to make the head touch the foot backwards, too, in the other back bends. So if you're actually on the yoga mat or in the asana class watching yourself, you'll see your inclinations and your vacillations and your mind habits and tendencies. And I like to think we could see them as if you were on a glass-bottom boat, looking down in the ocean with curiosity, with affection, even with endearment. Like, what an adorable fish I'm seeing down there. Most of the time we don't look at our mind habits quite that way. We don't say, oh, how poignant, how earnest, how well-intentioned, how vulnerable, how kind. We're tending to spend more time about our own mind chatter on what's currently called the negativity bias. And the negativity bias means that part of how the human brain is wired in its urge to promote your survival is that it will first consider the negative as an option to prevent you from making a poor choice and coming up against your demise. This is the most common example I use, so if you've heard it before, you get to hear it again. If you were in the jungle and you heard a rustling in the leaves nearby, the negativity bias would promote you asking the first question, is that a tiger? Now, something of life experience might promote the second question. That could be the wind. Is it the tiger or the wind? Does it matter? Yes, it matters, of course, deeply matters. To the negativity bias, it doesn't actually matter because it's already told you it's a tiger. It's already suggested you have to run for your life. And in fact, as I often put the question, which is the more expensive decision to make? Deciding that it's the wind and being wrong. There's a second activation of your negativity bias. What if I'm wrong? What if it's the tiger? What if I'm wrong? So when we're looking at our mind chatter on that glass-bottom boat, most often people are looking down at their mind habits on the yoga mat, and they're not finding them endearing. Often they don't even find them informational or instructional. You might find them annoying. They might judge them as problematic or faulty thinking or a pain in the neck, as it were. Does this happen to anybody in the room? Watching your mind chatter throughout the day or on the yoga mat too? I think asana is a great time to watch your mind chatter because what you bring to your yoga mat, you're bringing your day-to-day life with you. And this is why the yamas and niyamas come first. So if you want to spend more elegant time in asana, not so caught up in the mental patterns as being a sign that you're bad or wrong or flawed or faulty, you would practice the yamas and niyamas first. Then when you come to your yoga mat, you won't be so prone to examine yourself ruthlessly towards the negativity bias. You'd come to your yoga mat, and parts of your life would be very clear and sane and honest and kind. And so when you show up on your mat, you'll have a lot less mental chit-chat. The vrittis will be much less. So the yamas and niyamas, are these two words unfamiliar to anybody when I say yamas and niyamas? Okay, good, I'm glad you said. So yama means to control. I like to think of it more as like to have leadership rather than control, because the Western mind likes to control things, and I think leadership is more elegant than control. So yamas are the precepts or the commitments that we make to have more leadership in our lives in community. That is from us to others. And the niyamas, spelled Niyamas, the niyamas are the ways we cultivate leadership in our own lives over our own patterns and habits. To remember them, you might say the yamas and the me yamas. The yamas for all of us, and the me yamas are about me. Now, that being said, I don't think our ancestor yogis would mind if we translate these to be all niyamas and all yamas. So in relationship to others, in relationship to myself, for every one of the precepts. Any questions about that? Okay, so I shall tell you what the yamas are first. There are 10 yamas, but most people only learn 5. So I'll tell you the first 5, and then I'll tell you why there's 5 more. And the classical 5, now they're called classical because they got written in the textbook. So I guess the other 5 got written on a different palm leaf, and they weren't included in the beginning. But the first 5 of the yamas, they start with ahimsa. Ahimsa means non-violence. Literally means the absence of violence. Ah meaning absence, himsa meaning violence, means the absence of violence. So let's imagine that you were able to live your life with ahimsa towards all other humans, all other friends and family and civilians, and towards yourself. So when you came to your yoga mat, you'd probably have a lot less mental chit-chat. Can you see how that might translate? Your mind would be less disturbed by its lack of integrity when it's practicing himsa rather than ahimsa. Because ahimsa, actually nonviolence, is our natural state unless we feel threatened and the negativity bias shoots up. Then we have the urge to protect ourselves. And sometimes we'll do that with fighting, with fleeing. Other times we might freeze or collapse. But unless we're actually under threat, we don't need to have the chronic sense of himsa as an option towards ourselves or towards others. And just to clarify, what is violence?
What's the obvious weapons striking someone, but it can also be communication and thoughts and doing something, whether it's overeating or undereating or doing anything, I guess, out of balance can be violent just to your being.
Yeah. I always like to think of these expressions on a spectrum. Like, we all have seen violence in the world that we cringe at and that we ourselves wouldn't condone or perpetuate or take part in. But if you look at a spectrum where it comes to violence, on one end might just be like basic disrespect to yourself or somebody else. That's an act of non-kindness or violence. Because disrespecting the body intelligence on the one hand, you actually have to work at that. You probably didn't notice you were working at it because your body acclimates to the ways in which we disrespect it. And we don't end up with symptoms until quite a bit down the road. So for example, disrespecting the inclination for healthy sleep. My dog doesn't disrespect his need for sleep. He's probably sleeping right now in the back of the room. He doesn't disrespect that need for healthy sleep, nor does he disrespect the need for healthy food. At the time it's offered, he's ready. He doesn't disrespect the need for fresh air. He doesn't say, you know what, nah, just do more Netflix, it's okay. I don't need to see the trees. I don't need the air, the elements. Like the natural instinct for us, we're also mammals, would be to respect those body functions and body needs. But we frequently disrespect them without a sense of any consequence if our body's resilient at first. But then we start having consequences. And sometimes we even get mad at the consequences. It's another form of himsa, like, damn the consequences. But the consequences are trying to get your attention. A little yellow flag saying, hey, look over here. This is called a symptom. You're having a consequence of this. So on that big spectrum, we can look at, as Molly was referring to, there's behavior, there's thought, there's action, there's communication. There's your internal dialogue. I would put under the category of himsa, I would put the self-critic, who's usually not telling you the truth, is often berating, and frequently more than unkind. I mean, is this how your inner critic is? Yeah. Blessedly, the inner critic fades. You look surprised, Monica. You have to give it less work to do. I mean, don't feed it so much either. When I say give it less work to do, I don't mean, change your behavior and become perfect so the inner critic has nothing to say to you. I mean, less often give it the task of evaluating you. Stop delegating to your inner critic the outcomes of your life. She doesn't have it. So on that spectrum we have himsa, or we can choose ahimsa. So if you were to commit to the life of ahimsa and just make that one commitment, which was done famously by Mahatma Gandhi, it would bring your life into focus. It would require a quality of determination to say no to certain thought clusters or certain mind habits, and to resist the inclination to fire up your negativity bias unnecessarily. It would require a great kind of discipline. It would also require you to surrender many things. Those things that cause your system to go out of balance, where you feel like himsa is an option. So simultaneously you'd be very committed, and you would equally need the art of surrender. And that's how we define abhyasa and viragyam, like absolute commitment and utter surrender at the same time. Those two wings are on the same bird, and it's not flying in circles. So absolute commitment, if I was to commit it to a certain path, also means surrendering the other options. Like I've committed to the path of yoga, so I surrendered the option of being, in my own life anyway, I surrendered being a math engineer. That was 26 years ago. Well, more than that now, I think about it, 28 years ago. But I made a commitment in this direction, which meant surrendering that direction. I've committed to living in Portland. I don't live in New York. So on the one hand, I'm here. I've surrendered the chance to have my house be in New York. I visit New York, but I don't live in New York. You commit to the act of kindness and nonviolence. You surrender the option of himsa. That's where abhyasa and viragyam are working. They're coexisting like that. One requires the other. Does that make some sense?
What were the Sanskrit names used for commitment and...
Abhyasa and viragyam. They're in the Yoga Sutra somewhere about 1.13 or 1.14. Yeah. So that kind of intense focus is actually a practice in yoga, and we'll come up to tapas in a few minutes, one of the precepts. So following ahimsa as the first yama, the second one is satya, means honesty or truthfulness. That's interesting that ahimsa comes first and then truthfulness comes second. So a quality of overarching nonviolence and then a commitment to the truth, to speak the truth, to uphold the truth, to feel the truth as spoken from others. Later in the precepts, you're going to hear a practice called Siddhanta Shravan, which means to listen only to what is true and clear. So here early on we hear one of the little stepping stones is Satya, and later we'll hear Siddhanta Shravan means listening to what is really clear, what is really true, and not anything else. So that implies not listening to gossip, not indulging your own mental fantasy or imagination or projection or transference. It implies listening to the sounds that are true in the world, like natural sounds, and listening to, we could say, scripture or teachings, or listening for the Dharma expressing itself in someone. In other words, probably not reading the Star or the Inquirer. Those look interesting on airplanes, I have to say, from across the aisle when I'm just resting, like in my seat. And I go, oh, like just the person up ahead on the left. Who's getting divorced? Who has two heads? You know, it's like that's the nature of the inquiring mind, right? Which is why we get snagged by those things, and our modern media and culture have figured it out. So we're fed things for distraction all the time. So ahimsa and satya are to bring us into focus and clarity. And then we have the opportunity to actually experience yoga coming through us, like consciousness coming through us. The next of the first 5 yamas is brahmacharya. It means to live in clear relationship to your own vitality and the vitality of others. It actually means celibacy, but you're urban yogis and yoginis, so I permit. I like to translate brahmacharya, Brahma meaning divine and charya means wheel. I translate it as being in the circle of the divine as a translation, but I translate it as a precept, like I honor my vitality and your vitality, and I don't try to muddy yours or muddy mine or mingle them unskillfully. I'm respectful of your sensuality and my sensuality, and I honor that. I also see how easily humans go awry in the world of the senses. All senses, not just the sexual senses, but ancestor yogis practiced celibacy. This was one of their precepts, and they were living in community, so they practiced ahimsa, satya, brahmacharya. Then they practiced asteya, not stealing, not taking that which hasn't been given to you. That's an interesting way to consider not stealing, which is, we think of that like an active process, like I actually take this thing that doesn't belong to me, I steal it. But asteya also means not taking that which hasn't been given to you. That's relatively high practice, right? What's that?
Freely.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. So they were living in community, and some of the ancestor yogis of our different traditions, they had a begging bowl, and they waited. And it was considered an honor for the villagers to donate to support the practice of the yogis, because yoginis were very rare. Did you know that? The times have changed. So if we see the population here is mostly female, and that's the case in America, but mostly men practiced yoga back then, and so they had a begging bowl, and what was given to them was what they sustained themselves on. So they practiced nonviolence, they practiced listening for what was true, speaking what was true, honoring the celibate commitment they had, not stealing or taking that which wasn't given to them, and they also practiced non-grasping, aparigraha, which in a way means non-fantasizing, non-daydreaming, non-grasping, not wishing for what you don't now have, not wishing for things to be different than they are. These first 5 stepping stones are already an enormous practice. Can you tell? How many of you practiced grasping sometime today? You wanted something to be different than it was, yes, at least somewhere, right? Yeah. Did anybody postpone having to go pee today? Okay, that's an acknowledgement. Mm-hmm. Did anybody wake up on time this morning and feel like, yes, I feel really vital, really enthusiastic? Some, okay, better result there. So it's like the way we reflect back on how the day was is the information that we need on our yoga mats too. So these first 5 yamas, I think, is really enough for somebody to work on, but the other 5 are interesting to hear. So we have, like across the columns, the 5 additional yamas I'm going to tell you about actually come from more classical teachings, and my teacher, whose name is Dr. Shankarnarayana Joyce, I just call him Acharya, but now he's been published by Shambhala Press, and so you'll have to look for under Shankarnarayana Joyce. I think the book is called The Sacred Tradition of Yoga. Is that right, Ashley?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you'll see in that book the 5 yamas and the 5 additional yamas, which I'm going to tell you about right now. The first one that's the first, which is the 6th, is Daya, like the studio name. Daya means compassion or mercy. Here it also means delivering accessible yoga alternatives, D-A-Y-A. But Daya as a translation means compassion or mercy. Similar to ahimsa, ahimsa is what you're saying the absence of, and Daya is what you're giving, what you're contributing instead. So mercy or compassion, rather than the inclination for violence. We also hear in these 5 additional ones the concept called arjava, which means to be straightforward on the path. Similar to being truthful or honest or clear. To be straightforward is to take the footsteps in the direction in which you're going and to stay clearly directed. Even if sometimes you have to tack the boat on the ocean a little bit, you are aiming for that particular lighthouse or that destination. You're watching the night sky to see how you're tacking, rather than having the boat wander to and fro, which uses up resources. And if you were a boat on the ocean with only so much fuel, you'd have a sense of directedness. In our lives, we actually have only so much fuel, but we forget that very frequently. So we forget to be directed. And then we have symptoms. And then we might get annoyed at the symptoms. Sometimes what happens is we have a symptom, so we learn to self-medicate the symptom. And then we have another symptom, and we self-medicate it, and we keep going a little further west than we meant to. We suddenly might swing back to go east, but we've learned how to go west, and we swing to east for very short times, we go back to the west. And that pendulum, we often find ourselves going further downstream by our own imbalances. So arjava means to be directed and straightforward. And quite likely it would be really helpful for most of us to have a beacon, a kind of light that we're being guided towards. Often that's in the form of a teacher or some teachings. You could even just say that your beacon is ahimsa, that that's what you're guided to express. That will totally transform your life anyway. Downward dog won't be necessary. You might enjoy it, but it won't be the thing that's transforming your life, like a complete practice to ahimsa. So after arjava, we hear about the practice called dhruti. And dhruti means to be steadfast in the face of adversity. I found this to be extremely helpful in periods of my life when I was having adversity. And I think there's a really important distinction to make because how many of you in the room have had adversity in your lives before? Just going to check. Okay. So you're not like a stranger to adversity. And did you ever have the thought like, I can get through this, I can tough it out, I can handle it? Or something similar to that. Like, I know how to do this, I can hold it together, I can push through this. Okay, so that's not what's meant by steadfast in the face of adversity. That we might call like toughing it out or using our spit and grit, which I've also done. So I'm not saying that the decisions we made were bad or wrong, it's that the Western mind's inclination is to apply will to everything and to know that we can get through it. But sometimes adversity is actually your teacher, and how you're planning on getting through it is with your old thought habits and your old strategies. And you might miss an opportunity. Do you understand what I mean by that? So if we might consider backing up from adversity and looking with a bigger lens, like, how might this actually be my teacher? Or maybe my teachings have just come up, and I'm required to bow to them and see what's really being asked of me here. To be steadfast in the face of adversity means to be steadfast towards that beacon to which you were moving with arjava, to which you were going in a straightforward manner. Not to like nose to the grindstone and bear through the adversity and hope to come out the other side, experiencing your spiritual life again or your persona again, if that were the case. Do you follow the distinction that I'm making there? Yes. So if adversity actually came up in your life as your teacher, you might have to practice first ahimsa, means not pushing it away or damning it, not damning yourself for having it. Then satya, getting really honest. How have I contributed to this adversity? What would be clear action in response to this adversity? And then practicing brahmacharya. How must I take care of my vital reserve so I can work with this skillfully? Non-stealing. Not taking the opportunity away from yourself from which you could actually evolve tremendously. Non-grasping. Not wishing it were different. Mercy towards yourself for the difficulties you're facing, and becoming once again straightforward on the path towards the beacon, and then holding that steadfast quality. It sounds so easy, don't you think? Like just like that, you do it. You say it in just a couple minutes' time, and it's all better. But it's really a perspective shift that's required. And for us to consider that perspective shift, it helps to know other people have also considered it, and it's been skillful or wise or heartfelt in their own lives, and we can be inspired by the outcomes, which is also why we practice together, why we do need a sense of community. So following that straightforward path and the consistency and resilience, really, in the face of adversity, the next thing is called kshama, Kshama. Kshama means earth, and it means forbearance, which is really a quality of resilience. As the earth experiences the seasons coming and going, as she experiences the human imprint on her, she's doing her best to stay resilient and fruitful, as it were. The earth forbears. And we are encouraged to forbear to some extent as well, for life always won't be what we want it to be. And often in the spiritual journey, you're required to face difficulties. So kshama means forbearance or resilience. And then we have the 10th one, which is interesting how it comes last. It's called mitahara. Mitahara means 32 handfuls of food a day. Twice. It's a good response, right? Ashley, can you open the 2 doors now so we can have a little cross breeze in the room?
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. So what they're talking about, mitahara, is referring to you would eat 32 handfuls of food twice a day to nourish the body for spiritual practice. That would be all that you need. Now, a handful in the West is like this. Scoop in, get the handfuls, right? That is not what is meant here. A handful is like when you eat in India and you use the fingers to pick up the food. So you'd have 32 handfuls of food twice. And that would nourish you, because you're just having spiritual practice and contemplation, and you're working on keeping the body really clear and having the consciousness come through you, and all the chakras are lined up, so you don't need a lot of food to sustain that. You get 16 additional handfuls if you're working hard labor. What I like to translate mitahara as is a clear and skillful use of your resources, and including the planetary resources. So how much food do you actually need? What satiates your appetite? And does that have enough protein, fat, and fiber in it for you? And how much water are you drinking? And how much do you really have to buy and own and hoard? Or how lightly can you live? How simply can it be? We would imply in mitahara that there isn't frozen food, and there's not preserved food because it wasn't a part of the practice back then. So this is 32 handfuls of food made freshly, like in the movie The Lunchbox, which I haven't seen yet, but I've heard about. Have you seen it? Anybody?
What is it called?
The Lunchbox. It's about the way, might I say, millions of lunches are delivered from homes where the wife is cooking to the husband where he's working in the tin receptacles that they deliver the hot lunch in to their spouse. So The Lunchbox is a story, I think it's a story about those delivery processes and how it all seems so chaotic from the outside, but it's all working from the inside. So in the ancient practice of yoga and Ayurveda, it's very important to prepare your own food, or someone else is making it for you from ingredients freshly and with love. So mitahara implies not leftovers and not frozen food and not canned food and probably not fried food. Sorry to say. I know at Elephant's Deli those tater tots are really yummy. And there's probably a certain number in there. Haven't counted them. What if there's 32 of them in there and that's all you get for one meal? But the commitment, again, that you would make, if you made that commitment, would be very strong for your life. If you're someone who's either used disordered eating behavior patterns before or is prone to, let me recommend that you don't consider mitahara as your main practice right now, as defined by 26 handfuls of food twice a day. I think it's worth acknowledging because I just published a book about disordered eating patterns and the recovery processes through yoga. But I do recommend looking at clear use of resources and how do you actually nourish what your vital needs are. Consider if you had mitahara, intensely focused, and absolute surrender of what you don't need. Like, do I need one more cashew cluster? I don't know. Do I need one more coffee? My body's absolutely no. I don't need any more coffee. It's not. The beverage doesn't agree with me, but sometimes people don't think about it. They just have it. It's just habit. It's been happening. I just was working with a group at the prison. These are staff members, not people who live in corrections. And one of the staff people loves really delicious coffee. And she's able to pack in the paraphernalia, and it's allowed. She's a staff person, so she brings it into her clinic there. She actually works as a dentist, and I asked her, because I'm there to help them with their resilience, and I asked, well, what do dentists think about coffee? They don't recommend it for your teeth. So she's drinking 9 cups of coffee a day. And she's having trouble sleeping. She's on balance. What's that? She didn't say that. She didn't get that far. But I had to encourage her to at least cut back on. So if you're going to start making a change of some kind, the change you might make, if you make it as like a all or nothing, a radical black and white change, it will probably backfire. But she committed to 8 cups of coffee a day this week. Wow. Means 1 less. So a few degrees in the right direction, and that is going to require commitment from her when she walks back into the break room and realizes that coffee means more than coffee. It also quite likely means a timeout, some nurturance, a treat, keeping her awake maybe. It means more than just the coffee. And that's where sometimes satiating your body has gotten confused with the practice of mitahara as a way to tend to the resources you actually need. So she'll have enough to learn in this week by surrendering 1 of those cups of coffee a day. So those are the yamas, and each one of them, taken as a practice, would require complete abhyasa in a culture that doesn't acknowledge most of those things as skillful ways to live. Because you'll be swimming upstream against your own culture, it will require focus to do so. It will also require surrender, to surrender your opinions about other people as you become more holy than them. I said that smiling. For anyone who's listening on the internet, like that was tongue-in-cheek. Right. Like to surrender what we think other people ought to be doing if we're doing it. Surrender proselytizing or becoming like a yoga missionary. Even surrendering giving advice sometimes. Just because something has worked well for you and you're totally focused on it, it might not be the moment to give advice to somebody else. So that can be a quality of surrender too. Many, many years ago, I was having my checkout dive as a scuba student. This is a pop quiz moment. Who knows what scuba means?
Self-contained underwater breathing apparatus.
Yeah, very good. Self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. Mm-hmm. So abhyasa is like the containment practice, right? So you take this unit under the water to go swimming several feet down, lower than you could on your own and longer than you could with just your basic lungs. So I went to my checkout dive, and this was a really good experience of abhyasa and vairagyam. The dive master, we were off the coast of Ixcalac, Mexico, which is right near the border of Belize, and the dive master took me, the only student in the class. I had private lessons for my scuba. He took me to the place where the tarpons school up in the afternoon to nap. This is what he said. And there were many, dozens and dozens of tarpon facing up current. And they were just doing this little wiggle with their bodies like this to keep themselves facing up current in the very same location while resting. And they all do it at the same time. So certain time of day, they're all there. So they're facing up current. We were going with the current. Tarpon are tall like Michael. Are you 6 feet tall? Tall, but they're bigger than you in their body mass. So and they're silver, strikingly, beautifully luminous silver under the ocean. And to me, they were immense, and I was tiny. I'm only 5 feet tall, but they saw me. I didn't see me with the air thing on my back, so they probably saw me as a little bigger than I actually felt at the time. But there were so many, we were totally outnumbered. We were going with the current. They're holding steady upstream in the current. I had to be very focused not to bump into them. He actually wanted us, we went right through the school of the tarpon, and you had to figure on, first surrender the urge to flail, or to back up in the current. I used to be a swimming teacher, so I have really good swimming skills. He was like, no, you will keep your arms by your sides, and you'll be very focused, and you'll just go really glidingly, slowly through the tarpon. They won't even take notice of you, but they might move their quote-unquote shoulder as you go by. And in fact, you just felt that little turn of the tarpon to let you by. So they were practicing Abhyasa and Viragyam, and so was I. And it worked out beautifully, and I got my checkout dive successfully. But I did feel the urge to hold my breath a few times going through the tarpon, as if that was going to affect them, because I had the scuba apparatus on, the self-contained underwater breathing apparatus. But the bubbles go up. They didn't mind. So that's Abhyasa and Viragyam in a nutshell. And if you're going to choose something of any of the 10 yamas, your life will require that kind of subtlety at times. Other times a kind of ferocity. And always the willingness to surrender your opinions about how other people should be doing it, or about how you, quote unquote, are falling short, or doing great, and then falling short, and then doing great, and then falling short. So don't make the decisions too big to start with. But I would encourage you to make a commitment before we leave this evening. And I'll tell you now about the niyamas, but let me see if there's any questions or comments before I do that.
Can you elaborate a little more, Sarah, on brahmacharya? You said it's taking care of your vital reserves. I got that part of it that you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. I like to say your vital resources, or your vitality, including cherishing what your reserves are. I could get sidetracked on the difference between reserves and vitality and resources, but I'm going to pause so I don't get sidetracked too long. Brahmacharya was meant to keep people's physical relationships very clear with each other. Like the yogi would not be having sex with the civilian, or with the villager, or with the other yogi or yogini. Specifically, celibacy. So that's a very classical and strict translation, but I'm adopting it for contemporary life. That means when you are intimate with someone, or you do have a sensual relationship with someone, it's very respectful and sacred and conscious. It isn't just to adjust your own physiology and then feel temporarily better. It's really for the purpose of yoga, of coming together with another person, consciously, deliberately, respectfully, beautifully. A lot of sexual relationships in our country involve substances other than sex. And so that would be considered a misuse of brahmacharya, like alcohol or drugs or something else, and then the sexual relationship, or getting it all mixed up in different ways with lust and projection and transference and objectification and so on. This would be a misunderstanding of brahmacharya also. Does that help some?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Any other questions that I can clarify?
With ahimsa, I keep thinking about the swamis that would pay for people to sweep the bugs from in front of them, so they didn't cause violence to bugs, but how there's the whole problem that it caused with caste systems, and only people who could afford sweepers could practice ahimsa.
Yeah. Yes.
And in past communities, it was really important to be vegetarian for the same reason.
Yes.
So
Some people translate ahimsa to mean vegetarianism. I think there's a place for really looking at the way you choose food, and which foods actually nourish your body and which ones are habit or cultural biases, like hot dogs. And I do think some people's food needs, as a vegetarian, they wouldn't be able to support their vitality. They wouldn't sustain their resources. So there are considerations to make based on somebody's constitution and their genetics and their health at a certain time. Like bone broth is considered very healing and really medicinal to some people, but would be aversive to the vegetarian. And there might be times in your life where your commitment to upholding your vitality has to have you surrender if you've got a super strong commitment, like a dogmatic commitment, not an intelligent commitment. You might have to surrender that to nurture yourself. And so it becomes a complex question. I was a vegetarian for 20 years, and a health crisis changed that decision in 1 week. 3 highly respected professionals all said the same thing without consulting with each other. That was kind of spooky. Yeah. Fortunately, that health concern, by the way, is over. So just to clear that up. I had good guidance and good care. Yeah. And by the way, the complexity of the Indian country as a citizenship I can't address. It can't be solved. And the fact that some could afford sweepers and some couldn't afford sweepers, and the caste system, we have our own issues here. When it's, in a way, it's just mirroring the human condition, just that ours looks more familiar to us than how it looks over there. So I won't comment much more on the country of India while I'm teaching about the teachings of yoga, because I actually think yoga is pointing to universal understandings that we can all benefit from. And there is heartbreak in India like no other place that I've ever been. And sometimes that is where you practice becoming steadfast in the face of adversity and not denying what you're seeing, and yet holding it all through the lens of yoga, even the perceived injustices, the filth and the poverty. Yeah.
When you're coming at these from a place of loving compassion, when you're looking at the yamas and niyamas that way, instead of dogmatically,
Yes.
I think it opens it up a lot more for everybody to access it.
Yes, because you can be quite dogmatic about any part of yoga. And I have had emails from Hindis who tell me that I should not be practicing yoga because I'm not a Hindi. Nor will I be. But the teachings of yoga I've been committed to, and I think in a relatively respectful way, in a wholehearted way. So the niyamas, which are supposed to be about us, then they start with one that I find interesting watching my teenage house dwellers. The first one we go to is cleanliness.
Sarah, how many children do you have and how old are they?
There's a 16-year-old and a 19-year-old in our home, and they're my stepsons. I've known them for quite some time. I've watched the cleanliness change in phases. Mostly cleanliness, like, I didn't know that the sink was that far from the dishwasher. I just had no idea it was so hard to reach it. Well, they are 6 feet tall. They got long arms, though. Yes, yeah. Yes, the more you know about the teenage brain, the easier it is to accept what's happening there. Yeah. I forgot there was a dishwasher. So cleanliness is the first of the niyamas, and it refers to things for yoga practice, like an asana practice. They always say in these books I was reading as a kid, it would say, do not practice yoga in the hot sun, and bathe before practicing yoga, which I'm going to call asana and yoga intermixed there. But it said, don't practice in the hot sun and have a bath before your yoga. I was curious about that as a kid. But as an adult, when I was becoming a yoga teacher and teaching for many years, and the students asked, can we go to Mexico for a yoga retreat? I said, oh, it's so lovely, wonderful, we'll go to Mexico. We got there and they said, can we practice out on the beach? I was like, no, because we can't practice in the hot sun. I told the students from the text from a long time ago. If you actually try practicing yoga on the beach, it's very difficult. It's too sun exposed, the sand hurts, the mat won't stay on the ground. It's slippery, and you end up with sand on everything. You end up with it on your hands, on your feet, in your hair, in your bathing suit. It's not pleasant. So we don't practice yoga in the hot sun, and we have a bath before the yoga. But cleanliness also means to keep clean your mind and your body for the purposes of yoga, of the transcendent experience of yoga. And then we have contentment, santosha. Means to practice the art of contentment, recognizing that what we have is enough. And then tapas means discipline. Also translates as heat or purification. And I like to think of discipline as actually causing enough heat, mental heat, that it's going to lead to the processes of purification or transformation. Because once you're committed to something, it gets pretty fiery, don't you think? Just the fire of commitment is great to stick with that. It will kind of burn away the mental samskaras and produce the possibility of transformation. So again, it's like abhyasa, but in this case it means discipline of your yoga practice. And then we have svadhyaya, to study yourself. Like we're waiting until 10 yamas and the first 3 niyamas have been mentioned. Now we're on the 14th precept. Now we're going to start studying ourselves. To the Western mind that likes to journal or go to therapy or self-reflect or self-critic, whatever, we're waiting till now to study ourselves. Yes, we're waiting until now because what you're going to study is what you really need to be reflecting on. What's left at this point in your system is where you want to be reflecting. Rather than studying yourself before you've practiced ahimsa and arjava and dhruti and so on, study after you've done those things. Now start reflecting because your brain state is going to be a lot more clear for actually reflecting on the true nature of yourself. Not just reflecting on the conversation you had yesterday or the one you're going to have tomorrow or the way that you messed something up or have to improve something else. Svadhyaya is to reflect on the true nature of yourself. And sometimes it's recommended to do that by reading the scripts of yoga, the scriptures of yoga. And then we get to surrender all of that hard work. It's called Ishvari Pranidhana, means to surrender back to the divine. And that surrender is similar to when we say abhyasa and viragyam, but this surrender is actually towards God, to surrender. I've done all this work, I've made these commitments and so on, and I surrender that which I might become. I surrender it to the larger picture of what my life might be. I surrender like the music that's going through the flute is not captured by the flute surrenders. So at this point in the niyamas, that surrender takes you to the next 7 ways to surrender, the next 7 niyamas. So one is called japa, and japa is a practice of reciting a mantra again and again to help your mind stay in the mantra, not in the mayhem. So a mantra could be love is all there is, or everyone is God, or consciousness matters, or thy will be done, or any mantra that you would come up with, Om Namah Shivaya, or I love dogs, or whatever the mantra is. Purpose of mantra is actually to quiet the habitual vacillating vrittis in the mind and to remind you of what you're directed towards, what is the beacon. So God spelled backwards is dog, it could be about dogs.
Just saying.
Yeah. Yeah. So that japa is to help the mind learn about surrendering, because you're going through the japa means you're not also thinking about other things.
It works.
Yeah. Then we have dana, D-A-N-A, means generosity, or making like at the front desk this evening when you came in, if you made a donation about the Dharma talk, that's called dana. It means to give of your resources to benefit others, to give what you don't need and that you could freely give to someone else on behalf of their awakening. In this case, on behalf of the teachings that might help people to awaken. We give generously. And then we have mati, which means faith in yourself as a person who can practice yoga. That requires a certain surrender. You can't keep the thought, I suck at this, or I'm not going to be good at this, or I don't deserve this, or why am I doing this? Or the person next to me has a better downward dog pose than I have. That's not functional thinking, by the way. We call that at the prison a thinking error. You might just call it comparison with you coming up short, but it's actually called a thinking error. Because yoga isn't about if their dog pose is quote-unquote better than yours. So mati, faith in yourself as someone who's practicing yoga, means releasing that mental chit-chat and coming into an optimistic and inspired relationship to yourself as a student of yoga. Like a real faith that this could happen for me. If I dedicate myself, this could actually unfold. Astikya means faith in the science of yoga. as learned from our ancestors. So those two kinds of faith may need to coexist for a while. Like faith that it works might be a little impersonal, but faith that it could work through you is very personal.
Peace.
Astikya? You can't figure that out? Astikya. Astikya. And then we have this concept called vrata, V-R-A-T-A, which means that you choose a personal sadhana, a personal commitment to which you're going to dedicate yourself as a devotion to God. Now this personal commitment could be like Mahatma Gandhi practiced ahimsa. That was his vrata, his personally chosen commitment. But there are interesting ascetics in India to see how they've chosen to practice vrata. Here are 3 examples that I know of directly. 1, a person might hold up their arm in devotion to God, like I'm doing right now, for years. That's their commitment. And they actually can do it. Muscles start atrophying, bones sort of fuse, the arm becomes misfigured. They might get a post to rest the elbow on from time to time, but they're expressing their devotion to God through a body commitment. They are ascetics. Ascetics means wandering, like mendicants. They don't have regular jobs. They're not required to put the arm down to bathe the child. They're not required to carry the groceries. So this is their dedication. They're holding it up like this. You can see the movie Naked and Ashes if you want to be kind of exposed to what the ascetics look like. It's a really interesting movie, but it's not your first priority as a movie. Watch The Lunchbox first. But in this movie you can see another ascetic chooses, I will never have my feet touch the ground. In honor of my devotion to God, my feet will not touch the ground again. Well, then his friend ascetic has to say, I will always carry my friend. I will always carry him wherever he needs to go. I will carry him. So they make a decision together. He says, my feet won't touch, and he's helpless to somebody having to support him to move to the next wandering destination. And the other guy says, I will carry my friends, and he puts him on his shoulder, and off they go. And somebody else decided he was never going to cut his hair. So he has like way too much hair, and somebody has to carry it behind him. I'm not recommending these practices for you guys. However, vrata does imply that you're willing to make a commitment. We were at the Brighton Hot Springs retreat in April, and we talked about the Ayurvedic daily cycle, and some of you made commitments based on that. It's that kind of commitment, like, I'll go to bed earlier. I'll have 1 less cup of coffee. I'll climb the stairs instead of taking the elevator. I'll park a little farther from the building. I'll get up on time when the sun is rising and the birds are singing. I'll lie on my left side after I eat my lunch. Now, these are just examples of what I've heard from people in the last couple of weeks. Those are considered a vrata practice. Your personally chosen commitment can be about your well-being, but what if it was also your expression to the divine, to say thank you for the privilege of being here? I'll express that gratitude by having 1 less cup of coffee a day. You might be more inspired to keep the commitment. And then we have Siddhanta Shravan, which I mentioned earlier, listening for only what is true and clear in the world, in the universe. Listening for consciousness, not for vrittis. Then you've made it. Now you can practice asana, which is the 3rd limb of yoga. So essentially it starts like this with some building blocks. You have your yamas, niyamas. And should you practice those wholeheartedly and diligently, when you come to practice asana, your body will ache less, your mind will be less habituated, your heart will be less petty about things that we've talked about before in the Brahma-Viharas discussion. Your experience of asana will be to transform you to the next limb of yoga, not just to repair your life because things below have been out of balance. So when you come to your yoga mat, if communication in your life has been clear, if relationships are clear, if there's kindness and grace and commitments and a sense of the shared sacredness in life, you come to the mat to celebrate this benevolence or auspiciousness and to move to the next layer of your yoga practice, which is pranayama. And asana is considered the bridge from, as I said before, this shore to the next one. Pranayama, we're going to pair that with pratyahara. Which means to turn the senses inward. I like to think of it as to nourish or soothe the senses. To direct them inward, certainly, to understand yourself and reflect. But they sometimes describe pratyahara like a turtle that's withdrawing into its shell. And I actually think the world needs more of us to be practicing yoga and stay in relationship with the urban plights of our time. So I don't translate pratyahara as turtling up, but rather as finding a way to soothe your senses so they're not so overwrought with stimulation. We can make better use of the senses. So here, asana takes us to the shore of pranayama and pratyahara. Pranayama are the breathing practices in yoga that help to still your mind. And then as your senses get quiet, a remarkable thing starts to occur. The brain actually functions more towards compassion and kindness and less towards the negativity bias. And this isn't just yoga speak right now, but as we were talking earlier today with the training students, literally pranayama will soothe your lizard brain. And because your senses quickly send information to your thalamus, which quickly sends it to your amygdala, which quickly interprets whether or not you're in danger, and then can very quickly rush through your whole system to tell you, get the fuck out of there, fight or flight, or do something about the circumstance, even if it's a minor thing but it's triggering you. If that keeps escalating in your system, your brain chemistry will promote more often anxiety, negativity bias, fear, apprehension, shame. So when we start breathing, the lizard brain calms down. And your mind will start functioning better because you're not absorbed with what's called the low road processors. When you start soothing your senses, they send a different kind of information to your thalamus, which sends an information packet to your hippocampus, which tells your wise mind, everything is fine right now. It literally takes a different pathway in your brain. And so you're using asana to get from one shore to the other. Having a clear life, you come to the bridge of asana and you transport yourself to this possibility here. And from pratyahara, we get to rise into the practice called dharana, which is a bridge to the next destination. So I'll write it this way. Dharana means concentration. I like to think of it like concentrated dish soap. A little goes a long way. By the time you get here and you're practicing concentration, a little goes a really long way. It's like highly potent medicine. Because you've already practiced the yamas and the niyamas, you don't have a lot of messes to clean up in your life. You're using asana to keep care of the body and make sure that you can have good brain function for when you breathe, when you soothe your senses. Now you're going to concentrate. A little bit transports you promptly to meditation. Dhyana means meditation. Samadhi means absorption or liberation, being absorbed in the big oneness of things. But by the time you arrive, I have to say this again, dharana is very effective even in a small dose. The quality of concentration isn't rigid or narrow or white-knuckled. It's kind, and it transports you. The work has already been done. By the time you get from dhyana, you are transported then to samadhi. We've practiced abhyasa and viragam, we've practiced our precepts, we've practiced caring for the body, the brain. And now here we are experiencing consciousness with humility. It's also why surrender keeps weaving itself through the pathway here. Like in the niyamas you hear about surrender more than once, and here in pranayama, surrender is the exhale, the exhale, the exhale. Pratyahara means soothing the senses, not keeping them tangled in the world. You have to surrender again at that level. Right? Dharana means concentration on what? This, but not that. Any questions about the niyamas or what I've said here with the 8 limbs? Yes, Julia?
Can you, I keep getting stuck on the word surrender, and you've used it quite a bit here, and in my reading, it's the same thing. And I think from a Western point of view, surrender means sort of a giving up of yourself in a way that has a very negative connotation.
Yeah.
Can you redefine it in a way that's more palatable to a Western?
I would be delighted to do that because, in fact, to write a book about yoga for recovery, which is what I just did recently, the book Hunger, Hope, and Healing, I put together 3 of the precepts put together are called Kriya Yoga. They're Tapas, Svadhyaya, Ishvari, Pranidhana. So we have discipline, self-study, and surrender. Well, those precepts I use as part of the basis of the work I do with Hunger, Hope, and Healing. And I got to translate them for Western ears. So tapas, which means discipline, in my book and in my work means self-nurturing discipline. That is the discipline and self-respect to care for, to nurture yourself. Most people think of discipline as like punishment or austerity or rigid or like control, getting it together. Svadhyaya means self-study, as I was describing before, which I translated as self-study with self-empathy. To really be empathetic towards what material we see when we get to the self-study phase of yoga. What we're seeing is the human condition, again and again, showing up in us, seeing it in others, but seeing it in ourselves. So frequently we're willing to have empathy or kindness towards another when we see their human condition, and we leave it for them. We aren't so able to offer that to ourselves. So Svadhyaya for me must include self-empathy, especially for Western ears. And surrender, I translate to mean freedom and forgiveness, which is a really different way of looking at surrender. And it is a surrender of parts of the self, but I would say it's surrendering what you've already outgrown, surrendering the attachments we have to how other people will show up or behave, surrendering that in us which isn't actually true. So like peeling some of the layers of the onion, what we're doing is discovering inevitably who we can be. But not surrender like resigned or apathetic, like we lose something, because you're actually in that surrender, who you can be becomes more expansive. Much like, can I draw a picture up here for you? So, if I had determined that somewhere in my life I get to be this pie slice right here, and that I'm limited to that pie slice, that's a small space to take up, considering I like to say humans have a 360-degree capacity, which we do. It's not just my concept, it's coming from upstream. But if I decided this is what I'm allowed to be, this is what I know myself as, this is my identity, in other words, this is the me, this is the Sarah Joy character, and I'm limited to that, surrender of this actually means it starts to get bigger, not smaller. Like the boundaries lessen, and you get to encompass more of the experience of human existence, including consciousness and the interpersonal awe of being on the planet with beings and plants and species that are sharing this planet with us. So I think of surrender as this immense freedom because I'm not bound to what that once was, nor to my conditioning, which was very strong conditioning for self-hatred and anxiety. I'm not bound to that, fortunately. And I have, in that bigger sense of freedom, I have the capacity to also forgive myself and my historical pains for the ways that they once shaped me and made my life very small, not very expansive. So that's where I look at surrender from. Is that somewhat helpful?
It is, because the term that I kept hearing in my own head is I'm surrendering by giving something of myself to someone else to control. And so when you say surrender to God or surrender to something else, it had completely different twists
Hmm.
on it, so I much prefer your definition.
Uh-huh. Well, and for me, I think one of the doorways I had to walk through again and again was this quality of surrender to what? And I used to call it to the immensity, like to this silent, benevolent, huge immensity that I tasted so often living at Brighton Bush Hot Springs, as you can imagine. Cold plunge induced, frequently, or ancient forest induced. Like, I didn't know what that thing was, but it was very palpable to me. And I wanted to be held by that, not held by my conditioned mind, which was very painful mind. And so when I use the word God, I actually mean that kind of big, benevolent sense of what I used to call the immensity, because I didn't have another word for it. And I wanted to be held by something larger than the pain of my history, something more loving. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one thing that came to my mind too, was just sort of letting go and allowing all that is to come in.
Yeah. So we might let go of how we leave ourselves as separate from, also as a way to say surrender. Like, I let go of that sense of my individuation here, my unique little cellular structure, and I let this cellular thing participate with all that is, both seen and unseen, known and unknown. Yes.
Automatically, I never thought of the lotus flower. I didn't understand how it came into play with yoga or any of this. But someone said it's like you're opening all the petals are opening up, and you're in the mud, but you have this flower that just keeps opening up.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that's really beautiful.
Yes. Yeah. Somebody has a poem, and I probably won't get this clearly, and I will not remember if it's Anais Nin or Hafiz. They're really different. Really different. But one of them said something like, "How did the rose ever open herself and give her beauty to the world?"
Emily Dickinson.
She felt the pain of being too tightly closed in her bud. How did she ever open herself? She felt the pain of being too tightly closed in the bud, something like that. Right. Now somebody else said they felt how did the flower ever open itself to the world? It felt the encouragement of light against its being. And that might have been Emily Dickinson. So anyway, these are the things we hear from mystics and poets and people who've experienced, like Emily Dickinson specifically, they might have experienced a lot of pain and poignancy in life, and they tasted something of an opening, like the lotus flower. And we hear from them about the ache that the human experience can have when it wants to open, and the ache of opening. It's a little bit like if you've ever had your arm, as I did a couple times as a kid, you've had your arm in a cast. It learns this position. They take the cast off. You could stay in that position. You got trained for that position, and the bones got set that way. Or you could work it through the pain of regaining mobility and expression and going. That's how it also defines surrender. Like, I just took the cast off. Am I going to regain my movement and my capacity and freedom? Or am I going to hold the position that the cast gave me because of the owie I had from falling off the high bar as a gymnast? Will I want to hold that memory so strongly that my elbow will be in this configuration as my vrata practice for the rest of my life? But when we start working the muscles of an injury like that, or you thaw frostbite, it's actually very painful in the start. And it was excruciating to move the arm again, particularly because I was young when I had broken my arm, and the therapy of the day was for the therapist to pull and push the arm into new positions. It was very rudimentary and very painful. I got a lot of ice cream after those visits. Yes, Ariel.
Someone pointed out to me how incredibly brave it is to surrender, and that because I had a similar journey with the word surrender, I was triggering surrender sounds like not a good thing, and someone mentioned it's the bravest thing you can do to be expansive, to open up your bud.
Yes.
And this picture reminds me. There's a beautiful song. It's called "I Am a Hollow Bamboo."
Oh.
And you just let yourself be that hollow bamboo, and that's surrender.
Lovely. Yeah.
I've heard it described like a trapeze artist, that in order to get to the next trapeze, they have to let go.
Mm-hmm.
And if they don't let go, then the trapeze that was coming goes away.
Right.
And if they want to get there, they can't do it halfway, because then they end up holding on to both, and they're like, awkwardly frozen.
Yes.
They have to fully let go to get to the other one.
Yes. Yeah.
So to move forward, you have to let go.
That's great. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's a good question, Julia. Thank you. Sparks good other questions and comments. Anything else that I could help with at this moment before we sit quietly again?
What was cleanliness? That was the one Sanskrit word I did not get.
Oh, cleanliness you would say in Sanskrit, saucha, S-A-U-C-H-A, saucha. And it also means keeping your environment clean so you can practice the yoga. Like, the yoga, this is how I learned to say it in India. The yoga, yeah. The Indians asked the tourists, are you going to do the yoga now? When they see our yoga mats, so the yoga. It's keeping the environment prepared for your yoga. So like for years and years and years, the quote-unquote extra bedroom in our house is a yoga room. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have furniture really to speak of in there. There's a yoga mat available all the time. And there used to be an inversion swing available too, but we have to move it because of a door we got to install. You just can't have the door open when you're hanging upside down. You don't want somebody walking in that door while you're dangling there. But it's really intended to have the environment, internal and external, prepared for yoga. So cleanly diet. You get on your yoga mat, you're not hungover. You're not trying to process food that doesn't digest well for you. Your muscles and tissues aren't trying to work on something which you've had an allergic or inflammatory reaction to because you ingested it for the treat that it was going to be for a moment. And the symptoms is going to be on your yoga mat, like that. Yeah.
What's the difference between Sadhanta Shravan, hearing the truth of the universe, and truthfulness?
Satya is our commitment to speaking the truth. And Siddhanta Shravan, which is in your training manual spelled out, means listening for what's true in the universe. It means setting aside the gossip and the untruths and listening for what's really clear. You might consider back in the history of yoga that lots of people, humans, were becoming self-nominated swamis and might not have had the merit to do so. So there was a lot of talk and teaching and suggestions that might not have been mature. So that in this way, back in history, the yogis, the students, the sannyasins had to listen for a really clear teacher to emerge, not just a pseudo-teacher to emerge. We've had trouble with that in our country too, and so you have to listen for the clear presence of the teacher, listen for the actual experience of truth. Like this. Good question. Okay, let's sit for a few moments on that note. We'll listen to silence. I do welcome you to make yourself comfortable. And you may close your eyes if you choose. You may quietly look down if you prefer. from a place of quiet and from intuition. As I ring the bell, I'll do it a few times. I'm going to ask you to welcome a personal commitment to arise out of your intuition again or out of your silence. A commitment that you might be able to make for the next week on behalf of your own path through yoga. Just as the sound of the bell is always contained within it prior to its being rung, so too this commitment might already be in your intuition. And how might that commitment express itself in the next week? You may join your hands together in Anjali Mudra. Thank you, everyone. Namaste.
Namaste.